He walked into the boardroom in a suit that cost less than Ronald's watch. And Ronald Speaks, the man who had been sitting in Kenneth's chair, signing Kenneth's contracts, spending Kenneth's company into a scheme, looked up and felt the temperature change before he understood why. "This is unexpected," Ronald said. "Smooth, practiced." Still running the calculation, Kenneth set the briefcase on the table, opened it, placed 3 documents in front of the board members without a word. Ronald's eyes moved to the papers, then back to Kenneth. "Whatever you've been told, there's context here. Day 9, Kenneth said. 8:20 a.m. You were on the phone. The door wasn't fully closed." He looked at Ronald the way you look at something you built and watched someone else break. "You said you didn't need the real numbers. You needed the numbers they wanted to see." The room went very still. "I heard you," Kenneth said. "I was mopping the hallway, 40 days, same building, same floors." Ronald Speaks had never once looked at the janitor. That was his mistake. Atlanta doesn't wake up gentle, it slams into you. The heat first, even before sunrise, pressing down on the city like something that never left from the night before. Then the sound, the distant drum of the highway, the MARTA train somewhere underground, the compressors on the loading docks, kicking on one by one like a row of old men clearing their throats. Kenneth Darrow knew this city's morning sounds the way you know a song you didn't choose to memorize. It just happened. Years of it. And now at 5:43 a.m., standing in the service elevator of the building he built, he was listening to those sounds through a narrow shaft vent and thinking about how strange it was. How genuinely, absurdly strange. He owned this elevator. Not in the way people say they own things: the mortgage, the payment plan, the legal fiction of possession. He owned it the way you own something you made with your hands. The whole building. The lease, the renovation contract, the security system he'd argued about with 3 different vendors, before finally choosing the one with the worst sales pitch but the best hardware. He owned the carpet in the executive suites, which he'd picked out himself from samples, spread across his kitchen table, at midnight, age 23, eating cold rice and trying to figure out what professionalism looked like when you'd spent your whole life being told you'd never be in a room that needed that kind of carpet. And now he was riding up to the 28th floor in the service elevator, with a mop and a name badge that said Kenneth in letters so small they looked like an afterthought. He shifted the cleaning cart slightly to keep it from rolling into his knee. The wheels were loud on the metal floor. He'd learned on day 2 to keep his left hand on the cart at all times, because if it drifted, the bucket would hit the wall and the sound carried further than you'd expect in a service shaft. Small lesson. The kind of thing you learn when invisibility is the whole plan. He hadn't told anyone he was doing this. Not his attorney, not his doctor, not his mother, who would have called it dangerous and foolish, and then made him her famous sweet potato pie while she lectured him, which was a combination of experiences Kenneth had learned to simultaneously dread and crave. He'd told Timothy Okafor 3 days ago, finally, because he'd needed a legal anchor. Someone who knew where he was and what he was doing in case something went sideways. Timothy's exact response had been a long silence. Then, "You know I can't officially advise this." Another silence. Then, "But if I were a younger man and it was my company, I'd probably be doing the same thing." Don't touch anything you don't have documented authorization to touch. That was as close to a blessing as Kenneth was going to get. The elevator stopped. 28. He stepped out into the service corridor, a narrow fluorescent-lit hallway that ran parallel to the main floor, invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed. The carpet out here was utility gray. Not the carpet he'd picked. That was the other side of the wall, behind the frosted glass doors with the brushed nickel handles that he'd also picked. Also at midnight, also eating cold food. He stood there for a moment, just stood. Because sometimes, in the 40 days that followed, he would come back to this particular moment, 5:43 a.m., on a Tuesday in late April, standing in the service corridor of his own company wearing someone else's name tag, and try to identify exactly what he felt. It wasn't quite grief, not quite rage. Something more structural than either of those. The feeling of looking at a wall you built and seeing, for the first time, that someone had been quietly removing bricks from the other side while you were sick and sleeping. He pushed the cart forward. The work began. Apex Strategy Group had 34 floors and a reputation that Kenneth had built from the particular combination of stubbornness and clarity that people called vision when it worked, and recklessness when it didn't. He had started it at 20 years old in a rented room in Decatur with a laptop whose screen had a crack in the lower left corner that spread another quarter-inch every 3 months. He had written the first business plan on that laptop at a kitchen table that was also his desk, his dining room, his filing system, and his conference room, depending on the hour and the need. The company had grown because Kenneth understood something that took most people a decade of expensive mistakes to learn. That the difference between a good strategy and a great one was rarely the strategy itself. It was the people who had to execute it, and whether they understood why it mattered, and whether the person asking them to execute it had earned the right to ask. He'd built Apex on that understanding, had hired people who were smarter than him in specific ways and given them room to be smart. Had argued with vendors and clients and occasionally his own attorneys when the argument was necessary, and had known when to stop arguing. Then, at 25, his heart had tried to stop, not metaphorically, literally. Viral myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, caused by a virus his immune system had failed to manage properly, caught during a stretch of 18-hour days that his cardiologist described with the specific diplomatic phrasing of someone who wanted to make a point, without sounding like they were blaming the patient. The point was that his body had been running past its limit for long enough that when something went wrong, it went wrong completely. He'd been in the hospital for 3 months, recovery at home for 6 more. During that period, the company had been run by Brian Holloway, his cousin, 45 years old, formerly a CFO in Charlotte, a man Kenneth trusted in the specific deep way you trust someone who has known you since you were a child and who has never, in your adult memory, lied to you. The handoff had been documented. A clear shareholder agreement. Kenneth retained 67% of Apex. Brian would manage operations. Major decisions required Kenneth's explicit authorization. It was clean, it was legal, it was witnessed and notarized by Timothy Okafor, and it had seemed at the time like exactly the right thing to do. Then Brian had hired Ronald Speaks as COO. 6 months later, Ronald had been elevated to CEO, a move that had happened through a board session that Kenneth had been informed of but not consulted on, presented to him as a fait accompli wrapped in reassurance. Brian had called it a practical necessity, had said the operations required someone full-time in the role, that Kenneth needed to focus on his health, that Ronald came with strong credentials and institutional knowledge. Kenneth had agreed because he'd been in a recovery phase that made sustained argument difficult, and because he'd trusted Brian, and because nothing in the documentation of the move had looked immediately alarming. The alarm had come slowly, over months, in the form of financial reports that showed patterns he couldn't immediately name, but that felt wrong, the way a note feels wrong when it's almost in tune, but not quite. In the form of contract terms he hadn't seen before. In the form of Brian's explanations, which were always plausible, and always left him slightly more settled than he should have been. The thing about a slow alarm is that by the time you hear it clearly, a great deal of time has passed. By the time Kenneth understood what he was actually looking at, he'd made a decision that surprised even himself. He needed to see the company from the inside. Not from the shareholder's chair, not from the quarterly review, not from any position that announced itself and therefore shaped everything it touched. He needed to see it from the place where nobody was performing for him, which was how the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Strategy Group ended up on the 28th floor service elevator at 5:43 a.m., with a mop and a badge and a name tag that said Kenneth in letters no one ever read. The thing about cleaning a 34-story office building is that it is, at its core, a study in other people's carelessness, not malice, just carelessness. The coffee ring left on the conference table directly beside the coaster, the paper towels that made it to within 8 inches of the trash bin. The whiteboard diagrams left uncapped until the marker dried out, the ideas half erased in ways that suggested someone got bored mid-thought and just walked away. Kenneth noticed all of it. He'd always been an observer, his mother used to say. He came out of the womb taking inventory, but there was something specific about noticing these things as a janitor that he hadn't anticipated. When you're the founder in the room, people perform for you. They're tidy, they explain their messes, they have reasons. When you're the man with the cart, they don't even see the mess, they just leave it and assume it vanishes. He cleaned. He moved. He was, in every observable way, not there. And so people talked by day 3. He already had a partial picture of the break room dynamics across 6 floors, who ate whose food, who had the passive-aggressive note-leaving habit, which team's morale was in freefall. By day 5, he'd started to understand the architecture of power on 28, who got to speak first in the hallway conversations, whose emails got responded to fastest, who people looked at when Ronald Speaks walked into a room. Ronald Speaks walked into rooms like he expected applause. Not obnoxiously. That was the thing. If it had been obvious, someone would have named it and the magic would have broken. Ronald had calibrated himself very carefully to exist just on the right side of commanding the side, where confidence reads as competence, where certainty reads as vision, where the $5,000 suit doesn't look like insecurity wearing a disguise. Kenneth had met men like Ronald before, usually on the other side of a negotiation table. You learned them quickly, the way their eyes move when they're calculating versus when they're actually listening. Ronald's eyes did a lot of calculating. Stephanie Oakes was different in texture but not in direction. Chief Strategy Officer, MBA from Wharton, 15 years in consulting, the kind of resume that announced itself before she entered a room. She arrived at her desk by 6:50 most mornings, which could have been read as dedication and was probably meant to be, but which Kenneth read differently after the first week. Stephanie arrived early because early was when the building was quiet, and quiet was when she made her calls. The ones she didn't make when the floor was full. He watched from hallways, from behind carts, from the quiet performance of wiping down a surface whilst somewhere nearby, a real conversation was happening. It was on day 8 that he first heard them together. He'd been mopping the hallway outside the large conference room door slightly ajar. The angle of the cart not strategic but fortuitous, when Stephanie's voice came through the gap, crisp, unhesitant. The voice of someone who had trained herself to speak without hesitation, because hesitation in a room full of people reading confidence as competence was a liability she'd apparently decided she couldn't afford. The Meridian contract has to be signed before end of quarter. If Brian gets involved directly, he's going to flag it for Darrow. A pause. Ronald's response, lower, a register Kenneth couldn't fully pass through the gap. Then Stephanie again, and this time the sentence landed in Kenneth's chest like a stone dropping through water. Brian's not the problem. Brian understands what's good for Brian. Kenneth didn't move. The mop stayed where it was. Outside, somewhere, a phone rang on someone's desk and no one answered it. He turned the phrase over. The thing about a sentence like that is that it sounds like respect until you hear it the right way. Then it sounds like a leash. A short, comfortable leash that the wearer has been trained not to notice. His cousin. The man who had answered his phone at 11 p.m. in the worst week of Kenneth's life and said, without drama, without conditions, tell me what you need. That man, the one Stephanie Oakes had just described as understanding what was good for Brian, in a tone that made clear the understanding in question was not wisdom but accommodation. He finished mopping the hallway, moved to the next section, did not change his pace or his expression, but he started writing in the notebook that night. The notebook was small and black, the kind you could get at any drugstore, and it was what janitors used for task lists, zones, schedules, supply requests. Anyone who saw it would see exactly what they expected to see and move on, which was the point. He wrote in shorthand. Half abbreviations, half a private notation system he'd developed during his early startup days, when he was taking investor calls in public spaces and needed to transcribe without being obvious. His mother had once looked at his notes and said they looked like a foreign language. He'd told her they essentially were day 8 entry, SO and RS conference room, door gap. Meridian before end of quarter. Brian not the problem, B understands what's good for B, implication. B has been managed, is aware, possibly complicit, separate from RS situation or core to it. Determine, he closed the notebook, lay in the Decatur apartment he was using as a base the same neighborhood, where he'd written Apex's first business plan, which he had never decided if it was symmetry or punishment, and looked at the ceiling for 20 minutes. He was not dramatic about what he felt. He had never been dramatic about things that hurt, which was a coping mechanism and not a personality trait, as his therapist had once noted, and which he had acknowledged and then not changed. What he felt was clear, the kind of clarity that costs something. It was George Wynne who first made the building feel like something other than a surveillance operation. Day 3. The basement break room, 4 plastic chairs, one table with a wobble, a refrigerator that hummed too loud to be entirely honest about its age. George had already been there when Kenneth came down after his first full morning shift, arms aching in ways he hadn't expected because he'd underestimated how physical the work actually was. George set a box of glazed donuts on the table without ceremony. "You're going to eat one of these?" It wasn't a question. Kenneth sat down, took a donut. George poured coffee from a thermos he'd brought from home, the building's machine. He explained without being asked, produced something that technically qualified as coffee, only because there was no law against optimism. They sat. George didn't immediately start talking. That was the first thing Kenneth clocked about him. Most people, when they're with someone new, fill silence like it's a wound that needs bandaging. George let silence be silence. He drank his coffee and looked at the wall with the expression of a man who had made peace with the specific shade of institutional beige a long time ago. 7 years, George said eventually. Kenneth waited. 7 years I've been in this building. Came on before the lobby renovation, before they put the glass wall on 28, back when there was still carpet in the conference rooms on 15. A pause. Good carpet too, not the cheap kind. I always thought whoever picked it out knew what they were doing. Kenneth said nothing. Bit his donut. They changed it 2 years ago. Put in hardwood. Cheaper to maintain, supposedly. George's expression made clear what he thought of that logic. Now every time someone drops a chair it sounds like a gunshot. This was, Kenneth would later understand, how George communicated everything important. Through the architecture, through the material choices and the policy changes, and the small operational details that most people never noticed, because noticing them required the specific kind of attention that only comes from caring about a place without being valued by it. George cared about this building the way a gardener cares about a garden someone else owns, with full knowledge of the power dynamic and no illusions about it. Over the days that followed, George continued to talk. Not every day, not always at length, but in the accumulated way of a man who had been observing something for 7 years and had simply never been given the appropriate audience. The support staff bonuses cut 3 years running. The maintenance request backlog that had grown from a list to a document to something nobody looked at anymore. A colleague named Angela Booth, who had been with the company 6 years, had covered 14 emergency shifts in a single calendar year, had been described in every informal evaluation as reliable, thorough, present, and who had been handed a termination letter on a Friday afternoon because she'd sent HR an email the previous Tuesdays asking about the formal process for documenting unsafe working conditions. Kenneth listened to all of it. He filed it. He did not tell George who he was. Day 17 brought Angela Booth herself, 5:30 a.m. basement corridor. She was standing near the elevator bank with a cardboard box not heavy, 8 pounds at most, which was what 6 years of a person's working life compressed into if you subtracted everything that couldn't be carried. Kung Aing. Spare shoes, a jacket. George was beside her. When Kenneth came in from the service entrance, they both looked up, and Angela's expression did not change in the way expressions change when you're expecting sympathy. It stayed flat. The flatness of someone who had already done the emotional work of this moment before arriving for it. 6 years, she said. Not to anyone specifically, just into the air between them. I have never been late, not once. They gave me the paper at 4 p.m. on a Friday and told me to clear my locker before 5. Kenneth helped carry the box to her car. It didn't take long. When he came back in, George was standing in the corridor with his thermos and a look of particular quietness. The email she sent, George said, to HR. Asking about the policy for reporting unsafe conditions, he paused. That was Tuesday. The letter was Friday. I know, Kenneth said. George looked at him steadily. You hear a lot of things. For someone who just started, I pay attention. George looked at him for another moment, the specific regard of a man who is not yet saying what he knows, but who has decided he knows it. Then he picked up his thermos and went back to the supply corridor. That night, Kenneth opened the notebook. The entry was short. A. Booth, 6 years, clean record, terminated 5 days after HR inquiry. Unsafe conditions reporting, pattern, complaint precedes removal. Check Angela's departure paperwork through Timothy. If no documented performance basis exists, This is retaliatory termination, actionable. He paused, then added, GW knows more than he says. He's deciding whether to trust me. Let him decide at his own speed. Day 9 was the phone call, 7:30 a.m., floor 28. Kenneth was running his morning rotation. He'd developed a precise route through the floor that maximized coverage during the quiet pre-staff period and minimized contact with the executive arrivals that began around 7:15. Ronald Speaks arrived between 7:15 and 7:30 with the consistency of someone who had decided that arrival time was a power signal and had optimized accordingly. This morning, Ronald arrived at 7:22 and went directly to his personal office without stopping at the assistant's desk or checking the conference room calendar, which was unusual. His standard pet pattern included a 30-second review of the day's room bookings, a habit that Kenneth had logged because habits were data. The deviation meant he had something specific on his mind, something he'd arrived to deal with rather than encountered on arrival. Kenneth was mopping the hallway outside Ronald's office at 8:18. The door was not fully closed. Something in the latch mechanism had always been slightly off. He'd noted it on day 4 and submitted a maintenance ticket under his janitor identity, and it had not been fixed, and the gap was facing him as he moved through his rotation. Ronald was standing at the desk, phone pressed to his ear, screen angled toward the window. The conference speakerphone was not on, but the room was not large, and the voice on the other end was leaking through the receiver in the partial, fragmentary way of sound that reaches you uninvited. Kenneth kept moving, but slow. His pace had a natural ceiling because of the cart, and adjusting it in either direction would read as behavior. So he held the pace and he listened. Ronald's voice steady and unhurried. The numbers need to land below 4.2 before Thursday. Not the real numbers, the numbers they want to see. There's a difference, and Thompson has to understand that difference before he goes into that room. The response from the phone, unintelligible. Ronald again. I'm not asking him to fabricate. I'm asking him to select. There's a version of the truth that works for us and a version that doesn't. Thursday needs the version that works. Then movement. Ronald turning from the window, becoming aware of the corridor. Kenneth was 3 steps past the gap. He didn't speed up. He didn't look back. He kept the pace, the hands on the cart, the posture of absolute unremarkability. A man doing his job. A man so entirely a part of the background of this building that his passage left no more impression than the ventilation system. Ronald looked at him for a second, then turned back to the desk. Kenneth reached the supply corridor at the far end of the hall, pushed through, stood on the other side of the door. The notebook came out day 9, 8:20 approx. RS personal office, door gap. Phone call, not the real numbers. Numbers they want to see, version that works for us. Name, Thompson. Meeting, Thursday. Board meeting per calendar post on 15. Confirm. This is fabrication framed as selection, financial statement manipulation, first hard evidence. He put the notebook away. For the first time since day 1, he felt something that wasn't the cold mechanics of observation, but something that sat lower and had a name he didn't say out loud, because naming it would make it about him. And right now it needed to be about the truth. He texted Timothy one line, have first piece, prepare for call tonight. The Thursday board meeting came and went. Kenneth wasn't in it. He was on 22, running a buffer over the hallway floor, and he knew it was happening because the calendar had been posted 3 days prior, and because at exactly 9:03 a.m., he watched 4 men in suits step off the executive elevator and walk with the specific, coordinated urgency of people who believe they're about to accomplish something. He kept the buffer moving, watched their reflections in the polished floor. He'd told Timothy. Timothy had told him to wait, not yet, not with what they had close, but not yet. So he waited, and the buffer hummed, and somewhere on floor 30, something was being built against him. The patience required for this was not the patience of serenity. It was the patience of a person sitting very still, because any movement risks the thing they're trying not to disturb. A specific, active, draining kind of stillness. The kind that wears on you in places you don't notice until you're alone at night and you realize your jaw has been clenched for 4 hours. He kept the buffer moving. Day 21 brought the email. He checked the anonymous account from a coffee shop 3 blocks from the apartment, never from the building, never from anywhere he'd been in the uniform. The attachment opened. He read it once. Then again. Then he set down his coffee and read it a 3rd time, Because the third reading is when you stop hoping you misunderstood and start accepting that you understood perfectly the first time. Board meeting. Emergency session. 3 weeks prior. Not announced to him. The agenda. A proposed equity restructuring that would dilute his ownership stake from 67% to somewhere between 41 and 46%, depending on how the new investment round was structured. Brian's name was in the motion. Brian had proposed it. Ronald Speaks had seconded it, had provided the financial modeling that made it look not just viable but necessary. Kenneth sat with the document open on his screen for a long time. He tried to do the fair thing, which was to consider every interpretation. Brian was protecting the company during a period of instability. Brian was managing competing pressures from multiple directions. Brian had been given information that made the move look responsible. Brian had been manipulated by someone more experienced in this specific kind of maneuvering. Brian had convinced himself this was the right move and had simply not found a way to tell his cousin the truth, which was a failure of courage and not of loyalty. He tried all of these. They didn't hold. Not because any of them were impossible, but because the pattern wasn't a single email in isolation. The pattern was the amended bylaws he hadn't been shown, the contracts with terms he hadn't approved, the phone calls that stopped when he sent unanticipated messages at unanticipated hours, the texture of 2 years of small decisions, each defensible on its own, that assembled into something that looked nothing like coincidence. He called Timothy that night, told him what he'd found. Timothy's response was careful, methodical, and ultimately grim. There was a bylaw amendment Kenneth had signed off on a package revision, buried in language about routine compliance updates, that could theoretically allow an emergency board meeting to proceed without his direct participation if he was deemed unreachable for a 48-hour window. That clause wasn't in the original, Kenneth said. No, it wasn't. When was it added? 18 months ago. You were in the recovery phase. You signed a package. Brian said it was routine state registration requirements. I know what I signed. He pressed his fingers against his temple. And if they called the vote before I can move, they could argue it's valid, Timothy said. That's why you need to act before they do. Not after. How long before they vote? 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe less. Why would they move faster? If someone suspects you're asking questions, a pause. A sick man who hasn't been visibly sick in several months is a variable that makes careful people nervous. Prepare everything, Kenneth said. Shareholder rights documentation, the amendment challenge, conflict of interest statutes in Georgia, all of it. I may need to move in 24 hours' notice. He ended the call. Sat in the Decatur apartment. Outside, Atlanta ran its night sounds, someone above him watching television, the sound leaking through the ceiling in the formless way of sound that isn't meant for you. Cars on the street, the distant rhythm of the train. He thought about his mother's apartment, 32 blocks from here, about the first time he'd told her about the business plan. She'd listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not her default mode, and so he'd known it was serious to her, and at the end she'd said, "You're going to build something real, baby. Make sure you build it on a foundation that belongs to you." He hadn't known, at 20 years old, that foundations could be eroded from beneath while you were sleeping. He put on the uniform at 5:15 a.m. He went back. Day 22 brought the meeting with Timothy Okafor 6:30 a.m., a small coffee shop in Midtown, not the office, because Kenneth didn't want to be seen in civilian clothes anywhere near the building's professional radius. Timothy arrived with a bag that looked like a regular work bag and contained 3 folders and the specific expression of a man who has reviewed difficult information and is deciding how to deliver it with maximum utility and minimum alarm. They sat. Timothy was efficient, as he had always been. The legal landscape was this. Kenneth held power, but that power had been carefully hedged. The bylaw amendment was challengeable. The authorization signature had been obtained under representations that were, at minimum, misleading, but the challenge would take time. Time that evaporated if the board voted first. The stronger play was not the challenge. The stronger play was walking into that building with evidence of conduct so clearly improper that any restructuring vote became simultaneously irrelevant and legally radioactive. "What do I need?" Kenneth said. "Documents. Financial records showing the undisclosed related party transactions. Communications showing deliberate concealment. Something that proves intent, not just pattern. I know where the records are. Timothy did not ask how. He had been a lawyer long enough to understand that there were questions whose answers were more useful to his client than to him. Be careful, he said instead. Be lawful. Call me the moment you have something. Kenneth finished his coffee, put on the cart's lanyard, went back. The building absorbed him the way it always did, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the complete indifference of a structure that had no mechanism for understanding who was pushing the cart through its corridors. Day 24. 4. Brought Pamela Doss to the supply corridor on 22. She was 26 years old, 8 months at Apex, a Spelman graduate who moved through the analyst floor with the posture of someone working hard to take up exactly as much space as her role required, and not a centimeter more. Kenneth had first noticed her on day 6 standing in the copy room facing the wall, her stillness the stillness of someone using the room as a privacy screen while she saucebolted herself. He hadn't gone in, had continued his rotation, had noted it and moved on. Now she came to him, not to the break room, not to a neutral floor, to the supply corridor, which required a secondary elevator badge that analysts didn't typically use, which meant she'd found a workaround, which was itself information. She set a folded stack of papers on the shelf beside him. I need these back. I put them in the wrong bin. He handed them over. She held them against her arm, not in a bag, the way you carry something when you've decided to retrieve it, but haven't yet decided what to do with it next. They asked me to rewrite a report, she said. Not preamble, just the fact. I finished a contract performance analysis. Found 3 contracts that are costing the company more than their stated return. All 3 have undisclosed connections to people inside the leadership structure, and they asked you to rewrite it with a different framework, which is a specific way of asking for a different conclusion. Kenneth looked at the papers. Did you write the version they wanted? No, good, he said it simply, without elaboration. She looked at him, not the polite half-second look people gave service workers, but the actual sustained look of someone recalibrating. Why do you say that? Because if you write it the way they want, you'll have a document with your name on it that says something you know isn't true. It'll be in the system, it'll be referenced, and the original will be in a bin. He let that sit. Keep the original somewhere they can't access, not your work drive. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know why I told you this. You needed to tell someone who wasn't in a position to use it against you, he said. I fit that description. She looked at him a moment longer, the look of someone who has received an answer that is more complete than they expected, and then went back to her floor. That night, the notebook. Day 24. P-DOS, Analyst, 22. Original report documents 3 anomalous contracts. Supervisor and SO pressured revision. She refused. Report matches vendor pattern from storage room documentation. Cross-reference when storage access confirmed. She's a witness and doesn't know it yet. Day 28, Wednesday, 10:06 a.m. The document storage room on 18 was reliably empty on Wednesday mornings between 10 and 11:30. The entire finance team had a standing all-hands-on-30 during that window. Confirmed from the corkboard calendar that people posted and then forgot about within 2 weeks of posting. He was in the storage room for 22 minutes. He didn't need to access any locked system. He photographed physical documents, things not yet digitized. Things nobody had considered securing because nobody had considered that the man with the cart would know what to look for. 3 contracts. The same 3 Pamela had flagged. Vendor entities with Delaware registrations. That evening, Timothy cross-referenced the registration numbers. All 3 companies shared a registered agent and a 6-month incorporation window, and one of them traced back, through 2 layers of holding structure, to an individual named Marcus Speaks, Ronald's younger brother. Conflict of interest, undisclosed, Timothy confirmed, required disclosure under Georgia corporate law and Apex's own bylaws. It didn't happen. If this went into the financials without disclosure, it did, then we're looking at reportable securities exposure, not just an internal governance failure. A pause. This is the second piece, Kenneth. The phone call is the first. You need one more. Something that shows knowledge and intent together, not just the conduct. One more. He had the notebook, he had the patience, he had, somewhere above him, a building full of people who thought the most dangerous thing walking through their corridors was each other. They were going to be surprised. Day 32 arrived with the particular quality of Atlanta light in late April, ambitious, without yet having the heat to back it up. Kenneth had developed, over 5 weeks of early mornings, a fluency in this city's light, the way you develop fluency in a language you're forced to use every day. He knew what each hour looked like from the service corridors and what it meant for foot traffic. He was outside Ronald's personal office at 8:20. The latch gap was still there. Maintenance still hadn't fixed it. The ticket still sitting in whatever queue it was sitting in, the small systemic failure that had been his best inadvertent intelligence asset for 5 weeks. Ronald was at the desk. Standing, phone to his ear. Screen toward the window, Kenneth held the pace. Slow, the cart in front. The corridor long enough that 40 seconds of proximity was unremarkable. Ronald's voice through the gap. Brian has agreed. He understands that this is what's best for all parties. A pause, the response unintelligible from the distance. Then, Darrow won't be a problem. I've spoken with his physician. When the board session happens, there will be documentation establishing that he's not in a position to contest the restructuring on grounds of business judgment. Kenneth's hands didn't tighten on the cart. He'd trained them not to. He was 3 steps past the gap when Ronald turned from the window and registered the corridor, saw Kenneth. Held the look for a second, then went back to the call and closed the door with his free hand. Kenneth reached the supply corridor, stood on the other side of the door, opened the notebook. Day 32, 8:20. RS office, gap, call unidentified party. Brian has agreed. Darrow won't be a problem. Documentation establishing he's not in a position to contest. Medical documentation. Fabricated or manipulated. This is fraud. Not governance failure. Not policy violation. Fraud. Call Timothy tonight. Move faster. He texted Timothy 4 words. Nung Hearn Kehwijk then caught himself, crossed it out in his head and typed instead. Faster than planned. The third piece is in. That night's call with Timothy was the longest of the 40 days. 2 hours and 11 minutes. By that point, the conversation wasn't about whether they had a case. It was about sequencing. What Timothy called the architecture of disclosure, not just what you reveal, but when and in what order, because the order determines who has time to react and who doesn't. The financial conflict of interest documentation first, cleanest, most immediately legible. The phone call record second, contextualized against the contracts. The email chain which Pamela would deliver 5 days later, third, complex, requiring explanation. The medical documentation allegation, last, the thing that crossed from civil to potentially criminal, saved for the moment when the room needed to understand. There was no flaw beneath this. The bylaw amendment challenge, Timothy said. I'd rather use it as context for the board than lead with it. It makes the surrounding conduct look worse. Agreed. Some board members are going to be defensive about their own oversight failures. They'll want to understand how this happened without them knowing. Let them be defensive. Defensive is better than complicit. Edward Grant won't be defensive. He'll want to know what a cleanup requires before he commits to anything. A pause. Kenneth, I want you prepared for the possibility that even a clean board member will have questions about a founder who disappeared for 2 years and then reappeared doing janitorial work. Let them have questions. The judgment they should be examining is the judgment of the people who ran this company into a scheme while I was in a hospital bed. Agreed. But manage the room. I know how to manage a room. He did. He'd been managing rooms since he was 22 years old in a borrowed suit, trying to convince investors the black kid from Atlanta had built something worth believing in. And the thing about managing a room was that it didn't require performance. It required clarity. The specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what they're talking about and has stopped needing the room's permission to know it. How long do I need? 1 week. Maybe less. 1 more week, Kenneth said. He looked at the ceiling of the Decatur apartment. The same ceiling he'd stared at 8 years ago. A kid with a cracked screen laptop and a business plan, and the particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't know enough about failure to be appropriately afraid of it. When I walk in there, he said. Walk in like you own it. Timothy's voice, careful and certain at once. Kenneth looked at the ceiling. I do own it, he said. He hung up, set the alarm for 5:15, put on the uniform one more time. Day 33 brought Donna Mercer. He'd clocked her before you couldn't work floor 28 for 5 weeks without developing a detailed understanding of its ecosystem, and Donna Mercer was one of the ecosystem's more complex organisms. 38 years old. Senior manager of operations. 4 years at Apex. which meant she'd been there before Ronald arrived, which meant she remembered how the building felt under different management, which was itself a kind of data point that Kenneth had been filing since the first week. She moved through the floor with the measured efficiency of someone who had learned to never look rushed, because looking rushed was an invitation for someone to add to your list. She knew where every conference room was double booked before the calendar caught up. She knew which vendor calls needed to happen before 10 a.m. and which could slide to afternoon without consequence. She was, in the vocabulary of operations management, what people called indispensable, except Kenneth had been in enough rooms to know that indispensable was a word organizations used for people they relied on heavily, but hadn't gotten around to compensating properly, and that the gap between those two conditions was where resentment grew if you let it, or quiet integrity if you didn't. Donna had chosen quiet integrity. He could see it in the way she ran her day, not with performance, not with the self-conscious visibility of someone who needed to be observed being competent, but with the actual competence of someone who had decided that the work was the thing, and had stopped requiring anyone else's acknowledgement of that. He found her, or rather she found him, in the kitchen on 25 at 11:14 a.m. He was restocking the supply cabinet under the sink paper towels, dish soap, the individually wrapped hand wipes that nobody used but which someone had decided were a non-negotiable feature of a professional environment. The kitchen was empty except for the two of them, which was why she'd chosen this moment. "You're Kenneth." She checked his badge, not dismissive, actually checking, making sure she had the right person. "I want to apologize for what happened 2 days ago." He kept stacking paper towels. "No need. There is actually." Her voice had the texture of someone who had made a decision before walking into the room and was not going to be deflected from it. The floor on 28 was clean. It was clean when he said it wasn't, and it was clean the time before that. "I was standing in the hallway for the second one, and I watched it happen, and I didn't say anything, and I've been thinking about that since." Kenneth turned, looked at her. The quality of attention she was bringing to this conversation was not the attention of someone performing an apology for social maintenance. It was the attention of someone working through something that was genuinely bothering them, something that had been bothering them for 2 days and had finally reached the threshold where staying quiet about it cost more than saying it. "I appreciate it," he said. "I'm not asking for absolution." She held his gaze. "I'm saying it because it's true. There's a difference." The distinction landed exactly the way she'd intended it to. He set down the paper towels. "Do other people see what you're seeing?" he said. "More than you'd think." Her voice dropped, not dramatically, but in the functional way of someone adjusting volume to match environment. "But this is Atlanta. People have families, mortgages, kids in school. There's a calculation everybody makes every morning about how much they can afford to say, and most mornings the math comes out the same way, and your math." She didn't answer immediately. The pause was not evasion, it was honesty. The specific honesty of someone who didn't know the answer yet and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I've been running that calculation longer than I'd like, and I'm not certain it's landing in the same place it used to." She left a business card on the counter when she went. Set it down without eye contact, without ceremony, with the gesture of someone who had decided to do a thing before they could talk themselves out of it. Donna Mercer, Senior Manager, Operations. Mobile number handwritten at the bottom in the precise small hand of someone who wrote things down because they meant them. He looked at the card after she left, didn't put it in the notebook, memorized the number instead, then transferred the card to the inner pocket of the civilian jacket he'd brought in a bag. Some information belonged in a notebook. Some belonged closer than that. The notebook that night. D. Mercer Operations, 4 years pre-RS arrival. Observing. Uncomfortable with what she sees. Not complicit in the main scheme, not in any documentation. Possibly the clearest set of eyes on the operational floor. She came to me. Remember that? She came to me. Day 34 passed in the regular rhythm of the work, the floors, the supplies, the invisible presence in corridors, where things were said that were not meant to be heard by anyone who mattered. Kenneth was developing, by this point, a kind of fluency in the building's social geography that went beyond what he could have acquired through any formal audit or management review. He knew which teams were quietly excellent and which were quietly falling apart. He knew where the morale had collapsed, and where it was being held together by individual acts of will that nobody above the manager level had bothered to notice. He knew that the building was full of people who were doing good work in spite of the environment, rather than because of it, which was a particular kind of institutional waste that looked like health from a distance and felt nothing like it from inside. He filed all of it. Day 35 was the parking garage, the B2 level, 6:38 p.m. One fluorescent strip in the northeast corner had been flickering since week 2. He'd reported it under the maintenance system. Nothing had happened, which was a small and perfect illustration of exactly what George had described about the request backlog. The light it threw was irregular, cutting in and out in a rhythm that felt intentional even though it was just a failing ballast, doing what failing ballasts did. He was heading toward the service exit with the last cart of the day. The day shift had run long because there'd been a catering situation on 26, that nobody had mentioned in the morning briefing, 47 empty food trays, and a quantity of congealed risotto that suggested either a very optimistic caterer or a very pessimistic event planner. He'd handled it without comment, the way he handled everything without comment, because comment was not part of the role. He heard the footsteps before he saw Ronald speaks, not because they were loud, because they were deliberate. The sound of someone walking not toward a destination but toward a specific person. Ronald had timed this. He'd waited for the end of shift, for the garage level, for the moment of maximum isolation. That calculation itself was data. Ronald stopped 4 steps away. His suit was still perfect at 6:38 p.m. That was either dedication or vanity, and in Kenneth's experience those two qualities shared enough real estate to make the distinction mostly academic. Good evening. Ronald's voice had its usual quality, the smoothness of something that had been practiced until it stopped feeling practiced. Long day, usual day. Kenneth kept his hands on the cart, not defensively. In the way of a man who has a cart and a purpose and is choosing to maintain both. I've been hearing some things. Ronald's tone remained even, conversational, the tone of a man who had decided that power was most effectively communicated through calm rather than pressure. From people on the floor. About questions being asked. About certain areas of the building getting more attention than they usually do. Kenneth waited. I don't put much stock in building gossip, Ronald continued. People talk. That's what people do. A pause calibrated to feel casual. But I'm also someone who pays attention to patterns. And the pattern I'm seeing lately is someone who does their job fine, does it quietly, but whose attention keeps going to places that aren't really in the job description. The flickering light in the corner created an irregular rhythm of shadow across the concrete floor. In and out. In and out, I hear you, Kenneth said. Good, because what I want is simple. Ronald's posture shifted not dramatically, but in the way a room shifts when the temperature rises 2 degrees. You feel it before you name it. There are things in this building that are above the pay grade of everyone, except the people whose pay grade they belong to. The people who keep this place running, and I mean you. I mean the crew. They do that best when they stay focused on what they came here to do. When they work inside the lane they were hired for. He stepped 1 step closer. Not threatening in the way that you could describe in a formal report. Just closer. The step of a man who understood that physical proximity was a pressure instrument that left no record, and the people who step outside that lane, even with good intentions, even thinking they're being helpful, they tend to find that things get complicated. Contracts get reviewed. Arrangements get looked at more carefully. He paused to let that land. I'd hate to see that happen to someone who's just trying to do an honest day's work. Kenneth looked at him. Not up, they were close enough in height that looking at Ronald required no adjustment but directly. The kind of look that gives away nothing because there is a disciplined stillness behind it, a practiced neutrality that is not the same as submission, not even in the same family as submission, but which looks like it from the outside if you're the kind of person who mistakes stillness for compliance. I understand, Kenneth said. Ronald held the moment 1 beat past necessary, then nodded. Slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he'd already decided was confirmed. He turned, walked back toward the executive elevator. Kenneth stood in the B2 corridor with the flickering light and didn't move. He wasn't frightened. He'd been trained out of a certain kind of fear in the years of building Apex from nothing, not because fear was weakness, but because fear at the wrong moment was information you couldn't afford to act on. You learned to store it somewhere useful, to metabolize it into something that served the situation rather than the feeling. What he felt was clarity, of a different shade than the previous clearings, this one sharper, with an edge. Ronald knew, not who Kenneth was, but that Kenneth was looking, and the threat had been delivered not because Ronald was impulsive, but because Ronald was careful. And a careful man doesn't move unless he senses the perimeter closing. He texted Timothy from the service corridor, hands steady on the phone. He knows someone is looking. Accelerate. He's getting nervous. Timothy's response came 17 minutes later. Agreed. Call tomorrow 6 a.m. He pushed the cart to the exit. Outside Atlanta in late April, the temperature dropping towards something almost reasonable, the smell of food from somewhere nearby, someone's Thursday evening running its ordinary course. 5 days, he thought. Give me 5 more days. The call with Timothy the following morning was at 6:03 a.m. The coffee shop, the same corner table, the same unremarkable bag with its organized interior of folders and marked tabs. Timothy had pulled every accessible public filing related to the 3 Delaware entities from the vendor contracts. He had the Georgia corporate law statutes on related party disclosure spread across 2 open browser windows. He had, in the methodical way of a man who had been building towards something for 40 days alongside his client, assembled the available materials into the shape of an argument that could survive scrutiny. The financial conflict alone, Timothy said, is strong enough to force a board review. The disclosure violation is clear. The family connection to the vendor entities is documented through public records. Marcus Speaks appears on the registered agent filings for one entity directly, and the other 2 trace back through a holding company to an address associated with him. He paused. But the phone call is the piece that changes the character of this, from a governance failure to something that operates in a different legal category. A CEO who tells a subordinate to produce financial projections that don't reflect actual data, that's not poor judgment. That's intentional misrepresentation to a board. And the medical documentation piece, Kenneth said. That's the piece I want to be careful with. Timothy's voice had the specific careful quality of someone distinguishing between what they knew and what they could prove. We have your recording of the call from day 32. We have Ronald's voice saying, there will be documentation establishing that you're not in a position to contest the restructuring on grounds of business judgment. We don't yet have the documentation itself. We don't know if it's been produced or what form it would take. My physician is clean, Kenneth said. She would not have participated in that, I know. I've already spoken with Dr. Reeves' office, not in detail, not in a way that triggered any alarm, but enough to confirm that no outside inquiry about your competency evaluation has come through her office. Which means if documentation exists, it's either fabricated from whole cloth or it's coming from a source they've manufactured. Either way, it's fraud. Timothy closed a folder. Here's where we stand. You have enough to walk into that building and force a board response that Ronald Speaks cannot survive. The question is whether you want to walk in with what you have now or wait for Pamela's material. How long for Pamela? She indicated 2 days. Then I wait 2 days, and I go in on day 40. Day 40, Timothy confirmed. That gives me time to prepare the SEC preliminary contact form. I want it ready to submit the morning you go in, not as a threat, as a fact. There's a difference in how a board responds to the potential of regulatory scrutiny versus the actuality of it. The actuality is better. Always. Kenneth finished his coffee, put on the cart's lanyard, went back to the building, went back to the floors and the corridors and the cart and the notebook and the particular invisibility he had worn for 35 days and would wear for 5 more. Day 37. Pamela Doss came back. She didn't find him on a floor. She came down to the basement, which required a secondary elevator badge that analysts didn't typically use, which meant she'd either borrowed one or found a workaround. And either of those options required effort that was itself a kind of statement about how seriously she was taking what she was about to do. She was carrying a USB drive. She set it on the break room table between them. Small, black, the kind that looked like it had come in a pack of 5 from a drugstore and that nobody would look at twice in a cargo pocket or a desk drawer. Before you ask, she said, I know what this is. Tell me anyway. 3 months of internal email. Ronald to Stephanie, Stephanie to Ronald, and about 60 messages where one or both of them are copied alongside someone named Thompson, who I've located to the finance team on 30. She looked at the drive, then at him. I have backup access for server maintenance. It's part of my role. Nobody flagged it. I made a copy. He looked at the drive. Looked at her. You understand that if they find out you pulled this, Angela Booth worked here for 6 years, she said, and there was no drama in it. It was the way you say something you've rehearsed until the emotion burned off, and what remained was just the fact, clean and final. I've been here 8 months. In 8 months, I've watched 3 people removed for asking questions. One department head sidelined after she pushed back on a vendor decision, and an entire analysis my name on it almost turned into a document that said the opposite of what the data showed. She looked at him steadily. If nobody does anything, it doesn't get better, it just gets quieter. And quiet isn't the same as fixed. He picked up the drive, turned it in his hand. Why me, he said. Not the strategic version of the question this time. The actual one, because you're the only person in this building who told me not to change my report. She held his gaze. The steadiness in her face was not performance. It was the steadiness of someone who had made the decision before walking down the stairs and was not going to reverse it. Every other person I've spoken to in the last 2 months said some version of the same thing. Wait, be careful. Don't make it bigger than it needs to be. Don't be the one who starts something. She paused. You said don't write the version they want. That's a different thing entirely. He pocketed the drive. I'm going to need you to be ready, he said. Not today, but soon. If this goes where I think it's going, I'll need someone who can speak to what happened with your report from the inside. Someone whose name is on the original and who can testify to the pressure to revise it. I'll be ready, he nodded. She stood, started for the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame, not the theatrical pause, the functional one, of someone who thought of something that mattered. Who are you? She said. Not aggressively. Just the question direct, the way she asked all her questions. He considered it. The full answer was not available to her yet. The partial answer was useless. So he said, someone who has more reason to fix this than anyone else in the building. She looked at him for a moment, held the weight of that, decided it was enough, and left. He sat in the break room alone. The refrigerator hummed. George's thermos was on the counter from the morning, cap still on, because George always left it to be washed at the end of the day, a small domestic regularity that was among the most reliable things Kenneth had encountered in 37 days of unreliable information. He thought about Pamela Doss, 26 years old, 8 months on the job, carrying a USB drive full of evidence through a building full of people who had decided that survival required silence. The people who actually keep the lights on, he thought, are never the ones in the meeting where the lights get discussed. He texted Timothy, new material, call tonight. The call that night confirmed it. 3 months and 4 days of email, and the thread was not subtle once you understood the vocabulary. The careful language slipped at the compression points, the moments where specificity was required, and specificity was where the structure showed itself. Day 8 of the email record. Ronald to Stephanie. The Q4 variance needs to land below 4.2% or Thompson has a problem. Make sure he understands that the modeling is a projection, not a constraint. He has latitude day 31, Stephanie to Ronald. Pamela's analysis is going to be an issue if it gets escalated. I'll handle it, but we should accelerate the vendor confirmation before she has grounds to bring in compliance. Day 57. Ronald to an address Kenneth didn't recognize. Timeline is tighter than planned. B has agreed to the restructure proposal. We need the documentation in place before the board window closes. Use the same approach as before. B. Brian. He's not just a passive participant, Timothy said. That email makes him active. He agreed. He's coordinating on timeline. Kenneth looked at the apartment ceiling. What does that change? For him, legally, quite a lot. For you, it changes the conversation you need to have with him. Before you walk into that building, you need to know which side Brian is going to land on. If he's prepared to cooperate fully when this surfaces, you have a corroborating witness with direct knowledge. If he's going to defend Ronald, you need to be ready for that posture too. I'll talk to him. When? Day 39. The morning before I go in. That's 48 hours from now, I know. Is that enough time to reach him? Kenneth thought about it. The Brian Holloway he knew had grown up knowing had trusted through the most vulnerable period of his adult life, was not a man built for sustained deception. Brian's strengths were organizational, relational, reliable in the specific way of someone who shows up and does the thing he said he would do. His weaknesses were the weaknesses of someone whose trust was a door that swung both ways, easy to walk through, if you knew the right language, easy to close behind you once you were inside. He thought about the email. B has agreed. Not B was pressured or B was manipulated. B has agreed. The active voice of a man who had made a choice. People didn't drift into betrayal all at once. They drifted in small agreements, the easy decisions that felt justified, the slightly harder ones where the justification required more architecture. And by the time the architecture collapsed, you'd been building it so long you'd confused it for the foundation. It's enough, he said. If Brian can be reached, I'll reach him in 48 hours, and if he can't, then I'll know that too, and I'll plan accordingly. Day 38 happened in the particular way of days that are important, without announcing themselves, passing through the regular motion of the work, the floors and the cart and the notebook and the building's ambient self-absorption, while somewhere underneath the surface, the pieces Kenneth had spent 5 weeks assembling were settling into their final configuration. He ran into Donna Mercer in the elevator. Not the service elevator, the main one, which he occasionally used during the low-traffic windows when his rotation put him on the wrong end of the floor. She was coming from 26, he was going to 28. The elevator had the specific intimacy of confined spaces occupied by people who know each other in an unusual way, deeply, in a sense, but without the social vocabulary that usually accompanies depth. "You're still here," she said. Not accusatory. The particular surprise of someone who had been paying attention to whether he would be. "Still here," he confirmed. She looked at the floor numbers changing. 24. 25. "People are noticing things," she said. "The Thompson situation on 30 Finance has been running reports in off hours. Someone on 22 mentioned that 2 storage rooms have had access logs that don't match the cleaning schedule." She kept her eyes on the numbers. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you the water is getting warm." 28 arrived. He stepped out, cart first, looked back at her once. She was already looking straight ahead, the posture of someone who had said a thing and decided not to watch it land. "Thank you," he said. The doors closed. He went back to the notebook. Access logs. Off-hours reporting. 2 storage rooms. He had, by his own calculation, 32 hours. That evening, the last full evening before day 39, he sat in the Decatur apartment with his laptop open to the documents Timothy had sent over for final review. The complete package. The financial conflict materials, organized by contract and cross-referenced to the Delaware registration records. The board meeting documentation, including the proposed equity restructuring and Brian's motion. The email chain, organized chronologically with the key passages flagged. The recording transcript from day 9. The recording from day 32. He read through all of it from the beginning. Not because he needed to. He had all of it committed in the specific deep way of someone who has lived inside a body of evidence for weeks and has stopped being able to tell where the knowledge ends and the instinct begins. He read it because there was a ritual quality to the review that he needed. The same way he'd read the original business plan, the night before the first investor meeting, not because it would change anything, but because the act of reading it was the act of committing to what it said. The company was his, had always been his. The 67% was a legal expression of something more basic and more durable, the simple fact that Apex Strategy Group existed because Kenneth Darrow had built it, had made the decisions that shaped it, had understood what it was for in a way that nobody who came later had fully grasped, because you cannot fully grasp a thing you didn't create. He closed the laptop, looked at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would talk to Brian. The day after that he would walk into the building. He thought about his mother's from the kitchen table 23 years ago, the ones he'd been carrying since. "You're going to build something real, baby. Make sure you build it on a foundation that belongs to you." He hadn't known, at 20, that foundations required active maintenance, that you had to be present to protect them, that the act of building something was not, by itself, protection against the people who would come later and test its structure. He knew now. He set the alarm for 5:30 later than usual, because tomorrow was not a uniform day. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did, he slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of rest. Day 39. 6:23 a.m. The East Atlanta diner. He'd chosen the place with intention, the same diner where he and Brian had eaten maybe 40 times in the first 3 years of Apex. Back when the company was small enough that a Tuesday breakfast together wasn't a scheduling negotiation. Back when Brian's role was to be the person who remembered the details Kenneth forgot, who tracked contracts while Kenneth was on calls, who knew which investors needed a Friday email and which needed a Tuesday phone call because they were golfers and Fridays were sacred. Back when they were building the same thing. He ordered coffee. Waited. Brian Holloway arrived at 6:31. He was wearing the grey blazer Kenneth recognized from years ago, good quality. The kind of thing you buy when you think you might need to dress up more, and then discover your life doesn't require it as often as you thought. Brian had always dressed slightly more formally than the occasion required. A habit of preparedness, or of wanting to be taken seriously before anyone had decided whether to take him seriously. He stopped at the table. Looked at Kenneth, not in the suit, not in the uniform, but in the in-between clothes he'd chosen specifically for this conversation. Something that existed in neither identity. Then he sat. "You've been in the building," Brian said. 40 days. Brian put both hands flat on the table. Looked at them. The gesture of a man who is checking to see if he's still in the room, still solid, still the person he thought he was when he woke up this morning. "How long have you known about the equity proposal?" Day 21. Kenneth watched him. "About the rest of it longer." Define the rest of it. The contracts. Thompson. The phone calls. The third-party documentation being prepared to establish I wasn't competent to contest business decisions. A pause. One beat, then the sentence that had been sitting in the notebook since day 32. B has agreed to the restructure proposal. That was you. Brian didn't look up. "How far in are you?" Kenneth said. Not with anger. Anger would make this about feeling rather than fact, and he needed it to be about fact. "I need to understand what I'm working with. I didn't know about the medical documentation." Brian's voice was flat in the specific way of a man delivering a statement he has rehearsed because he knew this conversation was coming and wanted to get the words right. "When Ronald first brought the restructure to me, he said it was about protecting the company. That with the uncertainty around your health, the board needed confidence about the ownership structure going forward. That investors were concerned about a situation where the majority shareholder was medically unavailable, and you believed him. I believed him for about 2 months. Brian finally looked up. His face had the texture of someone carrying a weight they've been carrying long enough that you can see exactly where it sits around the eyes, in the set of the jaw. And then I started seeing the contract terms. And then I understood what he was actually building. And then he stopped. "In too far to get out cleanly," Kenneth said. "I'd already signed the proposal documents. My name is on a motion that I walked into thinking was about protection and turned out to be about extraction." His jaw tightened. "I'm not making excuses. I'm giving you the sequence. I know the difference." Kenneth looked at his cousin. "The 40 years of a person's life that you know in the particular way you know someone who has been present for the entire arc of yours, not always understanding, not always approving, but knowing." The weight of Brian's voice on the phone at 11 p.m., the way he'd looked in the hospital room signing the power of attorney, his handwriting steady in the specific way that means steadiness is the only thing holding you together. "Here's what happens now. I walk into that building today and I take back what's mine. You have 2 positions available to you. 1. You stand beside me in front of that board, and you confirm what I have documented. You tell them what you signed, what you were told, what you later came to understand. You become a witness, not a defendant." Brian's hands pressed harder against the table. "And the second, you do nothing, you let it play. And when Timothy files the formal complaint, which happens regardless of whether you're in that room, your name is in the documentation as a co-architect of the scheme. And you answer for that, alongside everyone else who chose their position." The diner around them ran its morning sounds. Coffee machines, plates, a radio behind the counter at a volume calibrated for employees and not quite right for customers. Brian sat with the 2 options for a long time, longer than Kenneth would have liked, which was itself information, not about which way Brian would go, but about what it had cost him to arrive at this table. About the distance between the man who'd driven 4 hours without being asked and the man sitting across from him now. "I'll be there," Brian said. "Good, Kenneth." He waited until Kenneth met his eyes. "I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything today." "No," Kenneth said. He stood. "Left money for the coffee. Today it just means you show up." He walked out of the diner into the Atlanta morning. The light was doing what Atlanta light did in late April, bright and directional. The city's architecture cutting it into angles that landed differently on different surfaces. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He thought about what Timothy had said, walk in like you own it. And then he thought about what was actually true, which was simpler and more complete than any instruction. He did own it, had built it, had been sick and trusted people, and been wrong about one of them in ways that cut in directions he was still mapping. Had spent 40 days invisible in his own building, accumulating the evidence he needed to say, in a room full of people who thought they knew who held the power, that the story they'd been telling was not the story. He went home, showered, put on the suit. It was navy, not expensive in the way that announces itself. Expensive in the way that simply fits, the shoulders doing what shoulders are supposed to do when someone has measured them properly. He'd had it made by a tailor in Decatur named Edward Crump, 71 years old, 40 years of making suits, who had looked at Kenneth when he described what he needed and said, "You're walking into something." Kenneth had confirmed this. Crump had said, "Then we make it so you don't have to think about how you look. You just think about what you're doing." He stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him was not performing. That was the important thing. He was not assembling a character or deciding how to hold his face or rehearsing what composure looked like. The suit was right, and the decision was made, and 40 days of evidence were in a briefcase that Timothy had delivered the previous evening, organized in the agreed sequence, tabbed and dated and cross-referenced with the precision of a man who had been building toward this alongside his client for 5 weeks. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring. She'd been awake. She was always awake before 6, a habit he'd inherited and sometimes resented and mostly valued. "Baby," just that. One word carrying everything she wasn't saying yet. "I'm going in today," he said. A pause, the pause of a woman deciding which version of this conversation to have. "Are you ready?" "Yes, you sure?" "Mom, I'm asking, because last time I said, 'Are you ready?' and you said yes, you spent 2 weeks in a hospital. So you'll forgive me for following up. That was a different kind of ready. This is," he stopped, looked at the suit in the mirror. "Yes, I'm ready." "Then go." Another pause. "You built that thing, Kenneth, with your actual hands, not metaphorically. I watched you build it. Don't let anybody tell you a different story about who it belongs to," he said. He wouldn't. He meant it. He picked up the briefcase and left the apartment. The cab ride from Decatur to downtown Atlanta took 19 minutes on a Thursday morning. He watched the city resolve itself, neighborhoods giving way to the closer geometry of the central corridor, the skyline catching the morning light in the way of things built to be seen from a distance. He knew every block of this commute in reverse, had driven it in the years when the company was small enough to feel entirely his, had driven it sick, before the diagnosis when he thought what he was feeling was exhaustion. He had not made it in 40 days. The building came into view. 34 floors. The lobby renovation he'd argued about with the contractor for 6 weeks. The brushed concrete floor. The lighting scheme the architect had called restrained optimism, and which Kenneth had called exactly right. The security desk. The Apex logo in raised lettering on the wall behind it. The font he'd chosen from 7 options spread across a kitchen table. That was also, at the time, a conference table and a dining room, and the primary surface on which the first chapter of everything had been built. The cab stopped. He paid, got out, stood on the sidewalk for one moment, not hesitating, but inhabiting the moment the way you inhabit something you've been building toward for 40 days. Then he walked in. The lobby was mid-morning, busy. The security desk had 2 people, an older guard he recognized from the early years, and a younger woman whose badge said Brianna. The badge readers blinked their rhythm. The elevators ran their efficient indifference. He walked to the desk, set down the briefcase. Brianna looked up with the reflex of someone whose job was to process arrivals quickly and move on. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one." He put his ID on the counter. Not the vendor badge. The other one, the identification Timothy had prepared under legal authorization, bearing his full name, his title as founder and majority shareholder, and the corporate registration number of Apex Strategy Group. "I'm Kenneth Darrow. This is my company." Brianna looked at the ID, then at him. Then at the ID again. Something happened in her expression, a rapid, visible recalibration, the look of a system encountering data it wasn't configured for. He picked up the briefcase and walked to the executive elevator. Inside, he sent 2 texts. To Timothy, "I'm in." To Donna Mercer, "I need you in the large conference room on 28 at 9:30. You'll understand when you get there." The elevator rose. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel of the doors. Navy suit, briefcase. The expression of someone who is not performing and does not need to be. The man in the reflection had been invisible for 40 days, had mopped these floors, and emptied these bins, and been looked through by people who were absolutely certain. They knew where the power in this building was concentrated. They were about to learn something. The doors opened on 28. Brian was already in the hallway. Gray blazer, hands at his sides. The posture of someone who has made a decision and arrived early to demonstrate that the decision is real. He looked at Kenneth, the suit, the briefcase, the particular quality of Kenneth's face that communicated readiness without broadcasting it. "You came," Kenneth said. "I came." Brian held his gaze. "I'm not going to say anything in there that isn't true. Whatever that costs me, that's all I need." They walked to the conference room doors together. Kenneth put his hand on the frosted glass panel, his specification 2.5 years ago, chosen because he'd wanted the executives in this room to still be able to see that there was a world outside the room they were in. He'd said that to the interior designer, who had written it down with the look of someone who had heard a surprisingly complete idea from an unexpected source. He pushed the door open. The room was mid-meeting. Ronald Speaks at the head of the table. Stephanie Oakes to his left. Donna Mercer in the middle of the long side, a legal pad in front of her. Two men in the slightly off-pace posture of people temporarily in someone else's geography, the out-of-town board members Edward Grant and Lawrence Obie, whom Kenneth had identified from the board documentation Timothy had pulled, and Jason Reeves, 39 years old, whose participation in the equity restructuring vote placed him in a category that Kenneth had already addressed in the prepared materials. Ronald looked up, the room looked up, and in the span of maybe 2 seconds, Kenneth watched Ronald Speaks move through a sequence that he would later think of as the recognition sequence, the rapid inventory of available options, the calculation of what could still be controlled, and the specific contraction that happens when a man understands that the room has changed shape around him in a way he cannot reverse. Kenneth Darrow. Ronald said the name the way you say a name you're buying time to process, using the syllables as a bridge between what you expected and what you're now required to respond to. "This is unexpected. I understood you were still. I'm going to need everyone to hold where they are." Kenneth's voice was even, not loud. Even in the way that a properly calibrated instrument is even the quality you get, not from forcing but from correct adjustment. "I have documentation that everyone in this room needs to review, and I'm going to take the next several minutes to explain what it contains and what it means." He set the briefcase on the conference table, opened it, placed 3 bound documents tabbed, organized, the sequence Timothy had designed in front of the 2 external board members and at the center of the table where both could reach. The first section covers 3 vendor contracts executed in the last 18 months. They were signed without the disclosure required by Georgia corporate law and by our own company bylaws, because the primary beneficiary of each contract has a direct family relationship with the individual who authorized them. He looked at Ronald. "You." Stephanie opened her mouth. The second section, Kenneth continued, his gaze moving to her with the same evenness, includes internal communications over a 90-day period. Those communications will make clear that the absence of disclosure was not an oversight. She closed her mouth. Edward Grant had already opened the first section. He was reading, he was not speaking. The response of a man who understood that the first words out of his mouth in a room like this would constitute his position, and who was not going to establish his position before he had the information to ground it. "The third section," Kenneth said, "is the one I want everyone to take most seriously. It describes a coordinated plan across multiple people in this room, and several who are not to use falsified medical documentation to establish that I, as majority shareholder, lack the capacity to contest a restructuring of my own equity stake. The recording of the conversation in which this plan is discussed was made on the 32nd day of my time in this building. The date, the time, and the location are all noted on the first page of that section." The room was very quiet. Ronald stood. "Kenneth, I want to be clear that whatever you've been told, there is context here that the recording was made 32 days ago," Kenneth said. "The contracts are dated, the emails are time-stamped. My attorney, Timothy Okafor, is currently outside this building with a complete copy of everything you're looking at, along with a filing ready for submission to the Georgia Secretary of State's office, and a preliminary contact with the SEC pending the outcome of this conversation." Ronald stopped. Grant looked up from the documents. He had the face of someone who had been in enough difficult rooms to know exactly how difficult this one was. He looked at Ronald Speaks with the clear-eyed assessment of a man calculating what the next 72 hours required, not what he wanted to be true, not what would be convenient, but what the situation actually demanded. "Ronald," Grant said, quietly, with a finality that needed no elaboration, "I think you should wait for your attorney before you say anything else." Ronald Speaks stood at the far end of the table and said nothing. For the first time in 40 days of Kenneth's careful observation, Ronald did not look like a man who owned the room he was standing in. He looked like a man standing in someone else's room, which was, of course, exactly what he was. Had always been and had for 2 years successfully pretended otherwise. The pretending was over. The room didn't erupt. That was the first thing. No raised voices, no overturned chairs, no moment of operatic confrontation that announced itself as the climax it was. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, more complete, the specific silence that descends. When a room full of people simultaneously understands that the story they've been operating inside was not the story they thought it was. Edward Grant was still reading. Lawrence Obie, 61 years old, long tenured, the kind of man whose presence on a board is intended to signal institutional seriousness, was on the second tab of the first document, his reading glasses doing what reading glasses do when the information behind them is dense and consequential. Donna Mercer hadn't moved. Brian stood near the door with the stillness of a man who had made his decision and was now honoring it by not requiring anything from the room. Ronald Speaks was standing at the far end of the table, and he was calculating. Kenneth could see it, not because Ronald's expression was readable. It was, in fact, exceptionally composed. The composure of a man who had trained himself to maintain surface stability under pressure, who had built a professional identity on the ability to project calm in the moments that called for it. But the eyes did what eyes do when the calculation is complex enough to require actual processing time. A small, rapid inventory. The doors, the people, the documents on the table. The man who had walked in from 40 days of invisibility and placed, in front of 2 board members, the condensed record of everything. "I want to be clear about something," Ronald said. His voice was still calibrated, still carrying the practiced weight of authority, the tone he used in earnings calls and leadership retreats and every other room where tone was a tool. These documents represent one interpretation of a business situation that was complex and fast-moving and handled under significant operational pressure. "I'd ask everyone in this room to take a breath before the SEC preliminary contact," Kenneth said, "was submitted this morning, not pending review, submitted. My attorney filed it before I walked in here. That's in the 3rd section, page 6. Ronald stopped. Because there is a specific effect that the phrase SEC filing has on a room full of people in business, it works the way a fire alarm works in a crowded theater. Not panic, necessarily, but the immediate and total redistribution of attention toward the named thing. The instinctive understanding that something irreversible has been set in motion. That the question is no longer whether but how much, and how fast, and who is standing where when the accounting begins. Lawrence Obie looked up from the documents for the first time since he'd opened them. He looked at Ronald, then at Kenneth, then back at the documents. He said nothing, which was the response of a man who understood that the first words out of his mouth in this room would constitute a position, the position, and who had decided that establishing a position required more information than he currently possessed. Edward Grant set his copy of the documents flat on the table, removed his reading glasses, looked at Ronald with an expression that had moved past surprise, past the first wave of institutional alarm, into the functional territory of someone managing a situation that required management. "Ronald," he said, and there was nothing in the name except the name itself, no warmth, no accusation, no protection. Just the sound of a man drawing a line. "I'm going to ask you to step out of this room while the board reviews these materials." Ronald's jaw shifted, not dramatically. Just the small muscular adjustment of someone processing an instruction they had not anticipated receiving. "Edward, that's not a request." The room held the weight of that for a moment. 4 words. The weight of them was disproportionate to their number, which was how authority worked when it was real. It didn't require volume or elaboration. It required clarity. And Grant had clarity. Then Stephanie Oakes stood up, not to defend Ronald. Kenneth had read her correctly across 5 weeks of observation. She stood with her hands flat on the table, the posture of someone who has been rehearsing a thing, and is now doing it, because the window is now and will not come again. The posture of someone who has decided that the cost of continuing to hold a position is finally higher than the cost of relinquishing it. "I want to make a statement." Her voice was steady in the specific way of steadiness that comes from having been afraid for a long time, and finally deciding that the fear is more exhausting than the thing it was protecting you from. "I was present for several of the decisions reflected in those documents. I did not initiate those decisions. I understood certain aspects of what was happening, and I failed to escalate that understanding through the appropriate channels. I'm prepared to detail everything I know to the board and to Mr. Darrow's attorney, in writing." Today, Ronald turned to look at her, the look of someone who has just watched the thing they could not believe would happen. Not quite anger. Anger would require energy that was currently being directed elsewhere, toward the suddenly very small number of available options. Not quite disbelief either, because some part of him had been calculating this probability for days. Something between them in the register of a man who has just discovered the precise location of a wall he didn't know was there. "Stephanie." His voice was lower now, the calibration losing its precision in increments, like a radio drifting from a signal. "You don't have to. I'm not asking your permission," she said it quietly, and the quietness was the whole point. Not loud enough to perform, exactly loud enough to mean it. Kenneth looked at her for a moment. Not with surprise, she had been moving toward this since the break room conversation, since the day she'd had to sit with the knowledge of what she'd been part of, and find a way to keep sitting with it. But with the acknowledgement that some things deserve a moment of recognition, even when you're in the middle of managing 17 other things simultaneously. Then he looked back at the board. "I need everyone in this room to understand something clearly," he said. "I am not here to litigate a business disagreement. What happened in this company over the last 2 years is not a difference of strategic opinion or a miscommunication about operating authority. It is the systematic misappropriation of corporate assets, the deliberate falsification of financial records, and a coordinated attempt to strip a founder of his ownership through documents obtained under false pretenses. While he was receiving medical treatment, he paused. Let the sentence stand on its own. That is the record. And the record is complete." Grant looked at Lawrence Obie. Something passed between the two men in the way that things pass between people who have worked together long enough to communicate without language, a micro-exchange of position, a confirmation of alignment. Obie nodded, slightly, in the direction of the door. Grant looked at Kenneth. "We're going to need time to review these materials properly. I'd like to schedule a formal board session, 2 hours, Kenneth said. "I'll be in the building. My attorney is downstairs. We can use this room or any room that makes the process most efficient. But I'm not leaving the building, and this concludes today." A pause. Grant absorbed the parameters, assessed them, found them non-negotiable, which they were. 2 hours, he confirmed. Kenneth looked at Ronald Speaks. "You'll want to use that time to make your calls." Ronald stood at the far end of the table for one more moment. He looked at the documents. He looked at Stephanie, who was not looking back. He looked at Brian, who was also not looking back. And then he walked toward the door, not escorted in that moment, not under formal instruction, but in the way of a man who understands that remaining is no longer a viable position and has decided to perform the exit rather than have it performed for him. 2 members of the security team were already in the hallway. Timothy had arranged their presence through the building's management office that morning, framed as a precautionary measure for a sensitive executive transition, and they fell into position on either side of Ronald in the particular way that is not quite an escort but is not one either. The door closed. The room let out its breath. The 2 hours were not quiet. They were the particular kind of busy that descends when a large and complicated situation suddenly requires everyone in it to locate their actual position, to stop performing the role they've been performing, and figure out what they actually think, what they actually know, and what that means for what comes next. Donna Mercer was on her phone within 4 minutes of the door closing, reaching out to department heads across the building with the measured, factual communication style of someone who had spent 4 years managing operations and understood that the difference between a crisis and a transition was almost entirely a function of information velocity. Get accurate information to the right people fast enough, and you contain the damage. Let rumors move on their own, and you spend a month managing the story instead of the situation. Stephanie Oakes sat with Timothy Okafor in the smaller conference room, adjacent to the large one, the working room, as Kenneth had always thought of it, the one without the presentation-grade lighting or the view that was meant to impress visitors. Timothy had come up from the lobby immediately after Kenneth's text. He sat across from Stephanie with a yellow legal pad and the specific posture of a man who has been in this kind of conversation before. and knows that the first thing you do is listen. Stephanie talked for 40 minutes without significant interruption. Timothy wrote, "Kenneth received a text at 9:47. She's thorough, more than I expected. Give her credit when the time comes." Brian Holloway sat in the hallway, outside the large conference room for the full 2 hours. He'd pulled a chair from the adjacent alcove. There were offices available. There were floor lounges he could have used. But he chose the hallway, which was a choice that communicated something without stating it. He read through the board materials Kenneth had given him a copy of, without being asked, page by page, in the complete way of someone who needed to understand the full shape of a thing before he could speak to it. Kenneth saw him through the glass panel when he came out to speak with Timothy at the 1-hour mark. Brian didn't look up. He was still reading. Edward Grant was the one who came to find Kenneth at the 90-minute mark. He found him near the service corridor entrance, standing, not sitting, briefcase at his feet, looking at the elevator bank, with the expression of someone who has finished the hardest part and has not yet determined what the next part is. "We've completed an initial review," Grant said. He was still carrying his copy of the documents with both hands, which told Kenneth the man had been handling them continuously for the last 90 minutes. "I want to be direct with you, please. The board's position is that the conduct documented here is disqualifying. The conflict of interest violations alone would require mandatory censure under our governance standards. The financial statement issues create liability exposure that we are not in a position to absorb without immediate corrective action." Grant paused not for effect but for accuracy. "And the documentation regarding the medical competency scheme, if it proves out the way your attorney's assessment suggests, moves this entirely outside the category of things we can manage through internal governance." "It proves out," Kenneth said. "My physician has already provided a statement contradicting any characterization of my decision-making capacity during the relevant period." "Timothy has it." Grant absorbed this. "Then, the board will not be defending the restructuring proposal. It should never have reached the stage it reached. Oversight failed, and I want to be honest with you that failure includes me. I should have asked more questions about the bylaw amendment when it was presented to me as routine. I did not, and that is a record I have to carry. It was the kind of admission that people in Grant's position rarely made with that degree of plainness. The habit of institutional language, the careful construction of statements that could later be characterized as something other than what they were, was so deeply embedded in the function of corporate governance that speaking plainly about personal failure had become, in most boardrooms, structurally unusual. Grant was doing it anyway. Kenneth noted it. "I appreciate that," he said. "What I need from you," Grant said, "is an understanding of what you want from this board going forward. Not just today's resolution I think we're aligned on today. I mean the next 6 months. The executive restructuring. The compliance review. What Apex looks like under your direct leadership." "Apex looks like what it was supposed to look like," Kenneth said. "A company that does the work well, that treats the people doing the work with the respect they've earned, and that doesn't build its margins on the backs of whoever is least protected." He picked up the briefcase. "That's not a complicated vision. It just requires leadership that actually believes it." Grant was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to begin the formal board session in 15 minutes. I'll be there." The formal session was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. It was systematic, precise. The word that would appear in the official minutes which Kenneth reviewed 3 weeks later was decisive, chosen with the institutional care of people who wanted to communicate that the board had acted with full information and clear intention, without implying that the board had been slow or negligent before, because the two things were both true and the language was doing the work of holding them in relation to each other without collision. Ronald Speaks was terminated from his position as CEO with immediate effect. The termination letter cited documented violations of fiduciary duty, undisclosed related party transactions action, and conduct injurious to the corporation, the specific phrases that, when they appeared in a CEO's termination letter, had the practical effect of making subsequent employment in comparable roles significantly more complicated to obtain. Jason Reeves was asked to resign from the board. He resigned, in writing, through his attorney, in a letter that was notably brief given the circumstances, which was itself a form of communication. The bylaw amendment was suspended pending full governance review and formal shareholder ratification, the legal way of establishing that it had been invalid, without using the word invalid in a document that would be filed publicly, because institutional language operated on the principle that accuracy and directness were separate considerations that required separate instruments. The equity restructuring proposal was formally withdrawn, not tabled. Withdrawn. The distinction mattered in the record and in the room and in the specific way that Brian Holloway's shoulders moved when the motion was recorded. Kenneth did not attend all of these proceedings. Some happened in rooms he was not in, via calls Timothy handled on his behalf, through the mechanics of corporate governance operating at the speed of crisis management. He was present for the decisions that required his presence and proximate to the rest. At 12:47 p.m., he stood near the window at the end of the 28th floor hallway and called his mother. She answered on the first ring. "It's done," he said. The sound on her end was not words. It was the specific sound of a woman releasing a breath she had been holding for 2 years longer, if you counted from the hospital call. Longer still if you counted from the kitchen table and the business plan and the 23 years of watching her son build something with his actual hands and understanding. With the particular clarity that mothers have, exactly what it would cost him if it were taken. "Tell me," she said. He told her the version you tell your mother, the one that keeps the most painful compressions in their compression, because some things get aired in quieter moments when you're not still standing in the building they happened in. He told her the board had acted, that it was over, that the company was his again in every way that mattered, structurally and legally and in the room. "Come eat something," she said. "I will. Today. Mom, you haven't been eating properly. I know you. Come today," he said he would. He meant it. The company-wide communication happened at 2:15 p.m. Kenneth had considered the format carefully with Timothy and with Donna Mercer, who had, in the 4 hours since the conference room opened, transitioned from senior manager of operations into something that didn't have a title yet, but which functioned as the person who understood how information needed to move through the building and was making sure it moved the right way. They discussed a written announcement, a recorded message, a cascaded communication through department heads, which was the standard approach for sensitive organizational news. He chose to do it live, not from the conference room. He stood in the hallway on 28, the specific stretch of hallway where he had pushed the cart for 40 days, where the carpet his contractors had laid was a color he remembered choosing from a sample board, spread on an office floor 2.5 years ago, and he spoke. He did not read from notes. He had not prepared remarks in the formal sense, because what he wanted to say did not require preparation. It required only that he say it. "I'm Kenneth Darrow," he said. 8 years ago I started this company. Most of you don't know me, some of you do, and the reason most of you don't is a story I'm going to tell you right now," he told it. Not the legal architecture of it, not the governance terminology that had been filling conference rooms all morning, the actual story. The illness at 25, the handoff, the 2 years of watching from a distance, the 40 days, the notebook, the cart, the floors he had. The floors he had mopped in this building, while the people who ran it made decisions that were designed to make sure he could never walk back in. The building was quiet in the specific way it got quiet when everyone in it was doing the same thing at the same time. 372 employees across 4 offices, watching a man stand in a hallway and tell them the truth without dressing it up or softening it or running it through the filter of institutional communication. "The people who actually keep this company running," he said, "are not the people who have been making the decisions. Some of them are in this building right now, and some are in our other offices, and I know who they are in a way I did not know 40 days ago. You cannot clean the floors of a place for 6 weeks without understanding exactly how that place works. Not how it presents itself. How it actually works," he announced the compliance review. The restoration of the year-end support staff bonuses eliminated without authorization from any shareholder, through a budget adjustment that had never been formally approved, which was the kind of procedural violation that reads as small until you place it alongside the other violations and understand that it was part of the same pattern. He announced the Independent Grievance Committee. He announced that every termination from the previous 2 years would be reviewed for procedural validity. and that any employee separated through a process that could not withstand that review would hear from the company within 30 days. One more thing, he said. Pamela Doss is being appointed Director of Compliance, effective immediately. Her first assignment is to make certain that what happened in this company over the last 2 years cannot happen again. She has the full authority of this office. He paused. One beat. If you have questions, I'll be in the building. I'm not going anywhere, he ended the call. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere below, the sound of the building reassembling itself. Chairs, voices, the particular audio signature of a place that has been holding its breath for long enough and has now been given permission to let it go. He found Pamela Doss in the analyst bay on 22:20 minutes later. She was standing at her desk, not sitting, standing, the posture she'd adopted, when the rumors started moving through the floor mid-morning, and she'd needed to be able to turn quickly in any direction. She'd spent the morning in a state of controlled uncertainty, which was the state you inhabited when you'd done something that could either protect you or end you, and the outcome was not yet resolved. She looked at him, at the suit, at the briefcase, at whatever was readable in his face about how the morning had gone. It worked, she said. Not a question. It worked. He set the briefcase down on the edge of the nearest desk. I meant what I said on the call about the role. 8 months, she said, which was still, technically, her argument, even if she was already deciding. The report you wrote, he said, the original one. The one you didn't change. He looked at her steadily. That report identified 3 vendor relationships that are now part of a formal SEC referral. Not because you found something nobody else could have found. The data was available to anyone in your position who looked at it honestly, because you refused to rewrite what the data showed when someone with more authority told you to. That's not 8 months of experience. That's a quality that doesn't come from years. She looked at the floor for a moment, processing, then back at him. I'm going to need real authority. Not nominal. If I'm running compliance, I need access to rooms that compliance needs to be in. You'll have it. And I need to be able to escalate directly to the board. Not through a chain that can be filtered. That's already in the charter I'm having Timothy draft this afternoon. And she stopped. A pause that was almost entirely unlike her usual directness. I need someone to tell me how to dress for whatever this is now, because I have been wearing the same 3 blazers in rotation for 8 months, and I don't think any of them are right for Director of Compliance. He looked at her for a moment. Something loosened in his chest, not much, but enough to register. I'll ask Donna. She'll have an opinion. Pamela sat down, slowly, like someone settling into a new version of a seat they'd occupied for 8 months. The Angela Booth review starts today. Today, I'll need the HR records from the last 2 years. Timothy is getting the access authorization right now. She nodded, opened her laptop, looked at the screen for a moment, then back up. You were the one who told me not to rewrite the report. I was. At the time I thought you were just a person who gave good advice. She paused. Why didn't you say something earlier? If you knew what was happening, I needed to understand the full depth of it, he said. Not just what was visible from the surface. If I'd walked in on day 1, they'd have had time to close ranks. The documentation would have disappeared. The people who were willing to come forward needed to see that it was actually possible to do, that needed to see someone taking the risk first. You can't ask people to take a risk you haven't been willing to take yourself. She absorbed this. 40 days is a long time to mop floors you own. It is, he said. It's also the only way I could think of to make sure that when I walked into that room, nobody could construct a different story about what had happened here. She turned back to her laptop. He picked up the briefcase, started for the elevator, then stopped when she spoke again without looking up from the screen, in the manner of someone delivering a thing they've been holding on to. For what it's worth, she said, the floors were always clean. Whatever he said about them, he didn't answer, but he took it with him. George was not in the basement break room when Kenneth came down at 3:30 p.m. He was in the supply corridor quarterly inventory, the kind of work that happened on its own schedule, regardless of what was occurring on the floors above, because paper towel counts didn't adjust for corporate governance situations, and soap dispensers required restocking on a timeline that had no mechanism for unusual days. He looked up when Kenneth came in, looked at the suit, looked at the briefcase, looked at Kenneth's face with the particular unhurried regard that was George's primary mode of engagement with the world quietly, without rushing toward the conclusion. "You did it," George said. "We did it," Kenneth said. George went back to the inventory sheet, made a notation with the stub of pencil he kept behind his ear. "I heard the company call. Marcus at the security desk let me use his phone. I listened in the lobby." A pause. "You stood in the hallway." "That specific hallway, yes. I know that stretch of floor," George said. "Changed the light fixture at the far end 3 times in 2 years. They kept specifying the wrong wattage. I put in the request each time. Nothing happened until the 3rd bulb burned out, and someone on the executive team complained about the dimness." He made another notation. "Funny how that works." Kenneth stood in the doorway of the supply corridor. The smell of cleaning chemicals, industrial soap, the paper and cardboard smell of cases stacked in rows, not an unpleasant smell. A smell with integrity. The smell of things that had a function and performed that function without requiring acknowledgement. "I want to ask you something," Kenneth said. "And I want you to know that your answer doesn't change anything I've already decided." George set down the clipboard. 7 years in this building," Kenneth said. "Watching the things you watched. Did you ever think about leaving?" George considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not the performative pause of someone deciding how to answer. The actual pause of someone going back through 7 years and looking at the specific moments the question was asking about. "And 3 times, he said. "Once when they cut the support bonuses the first time, and we found out through the payable deposit because nobody told us, just found out when the number was smaller and had to figure out why. Once when they gave Angela her box and I understood that nothing was going to happen about it." He picked up the clipboard again. "And once about 3 weeks ago, when I started wondering if I had been wrong about you, and I didn't know what to do with that possibility." "What made you stay that time?" "I decided I wasn't wrong," George said, simply. "The way you say a thing that you've stopped needing to argue even to yourself." Kenneth nodded. "The Employee Welfare Committee." "I meant what I said on the call, I heard. That's not a ceremonial position. I need someone on it who understands what this building looks like from inside the work, not from the management reports, not from the HR surveys. From the work, I understand what you're asking." George set a case of paper towels on the shelf with the precise efficiency of a man who knew exactly where things went and why. "I'm 60 days from 60. I've been cleaning buildings since I was 22 years old. I have opinions about what decent treatment looks like that I have never once been in a position to express to someone who could act on them." He looked at Kenneth directly, which was not something he did with frequency, and so when he did it carried weight. That changes now, Kenneth confirmed. He put out his hand. George looked at it for a moment, not suspicious, just present with the gesture, locating it in the context of everything that had led to it, and then took it. The handshake of 2 men who had been in the same building for 40 days and had known each other for almost all of them, and were only now meeting in the full sense of the word. "Go run your company," George said. He went. The call to Angela Booth happened at 4:12 p.m. Kenneth made it from Donna Mercer's office. She'd offered it without being asked, understanding before he asked what the call required. A quiet room, a door that closed, the courtesy of privacy for something that deserved privacy. Angela answered after 2 rings. The caution in her initial hello was the caution of a woman who had received institutional phone calls before and had learned, through direct experience, that their news was rarely uncomplicated. He identified himself, said the company's name, said his full name, a pause on her end. Recalibration. The name Kenneth Darrow arriving from Apex Strategy Group in a context she had not constructed for it. "I'm the founder," he said. "I know what happened to you. I know the specific sequence, the email you sent to HR, the timeline of what followed, the language on the termination letter. I know that the phrase performance issues was applied to someone with 6 years of clean record and 0 legitimate grounds for separation." He paused. "I'm calling to ask if you'd be willing to come back." The silence on her end had a different texture than her initial caution. Something careful in it, the carefulness of someone who has been hurt and is making sure the ground is solid before putting weight on it. Because the last time they trusted the ground, it gave way on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. "I don't understand," she said. "Apex terminated you through a process that wasn't valid." We're reviewing every separation from the last 2 years under the same standard. In your case, the review is already complete. I have the records. And there is no legitimate basis for what happened. He kept his voice even. The facts did the work. They didn't need his emotion on top of them. If you want to come back, the position is available. Your seniority is intact. Your compensation is adjusted to reflect 6 years of service. Benefits are effective your first day back. A longer silence this time. I want to ask you something, Angela said. Her voice had changed in a way he could hear the caution still present, but something moving underneath it, something deciding whether it was allowed to be something other than braced. A few months ago there was a new face on the morning crew. Young man, quiet. Ask me questions that nobody in that job usually asks. Kenneth said nothing. That was you, she said. That was me. Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't. Not then. He paused. I'm telling you now. She was quiet for a moment, processing the specific strangeness of the information that the person who had helped carry her cardboard box to her car on the morning she lost a 6-year job had been the person who, if he had known how to prevent it, would not have let it happen at all. That presence in the corridor had not been coincidence or kindness from a stranger. It had been the owner of the company watching his company do something wrong and not yet being in a position to stop it. The school where I'm working now, she said. I gave notice last month. I need to honor 2 weeks, take the 2 weeks. I want it in writing, all of it. Before I give them my final day, Timothy Okafor will have documents to you before end of business today. She was quiet again. Then, you were the one who helped me carry the box. I was. I thought about you after that day. A pause that contained more than the words around it. I thought that was the only person in that whole building who looked at me like I was someone they were actually seeing. He didn't have a response that would have added to that. Some things don't need responses. They need acknowledgement, which is a different thing entirely, and he understood the difference. I saw you, he said. I know you did, she breathed. The sound of a decision being made. All right. Send the documents. He thanked her and ended the call. Sat in Donna's office for a moment with the phone on the desk in front of him. Outside the window, Atlanta in the late afternoon was doing what Atlanta did at this hour, the light going gold in the specific way of cities that have survived enough to understand what gold means, the buildings catching it and throwing it back at each other in the geometry of a place that was, for all its complications, alive. He thought about the cardboard box, 8 pounds. The kunging and the spare shoes and the jacket, 6 years compressed into something a person could carry in one arm. He had watched that box go into the trunk of a car on a morning when he was not yet in a position to do anything about it. He was in a position now. He stood up, picked up the briefcase, went back into the hallway. Brian came to find him at 5:08 p.m. Kenneth was in the hallway on 28 again. He seemed to keep returning to this particular stretch, not from sentimentality, or not only from that, but because the hallway was the honest part of the floor, not the conference rooms where performance happened, not the executive offices where decisions got formalized into permanence. The hallway was the connective tissue, the part the building needed to function and that nobody with a title ever chose to stand in. He understood that now in a way that was not abstract. Brian stopped a few feet away. He'd loosened his tie at some point in the afternoon, which was the only visible adjustment he'd made to his appearance across a day that had required a great deal of adjustment internally. The board session is finished, Brian said. I know. Timothy briefed me on the legal position. A pause. My participation in the restructuring proposal puts me in a category he called cooperating with disclosure rather than principal actor. That's because I withdrew before the vote was called and because I haven't received any direct financial benefit from the vendor arrangements. I know that too. Brian looked at the carpet, then back up. That characterization is favorable to me. It came from your attorney, which means it reflects a decision you made about how to frame my role. It reflects what the facts support, Kenneth said. Timothy characterized it accurately. You could have asked him to characterize it differently. I could have. Kenneth looked at his cousin. I chose not to. Brian stood with that. The particular posture of a man receiving something he wasn't certain he'd earned, not quite gratitude, because gratitude would require more certainty than he currently had access to, but something in that territory. What happens to me now, he said. That depends on what you choose to do next. Kenneth looked down the hallway at the stretch of carpet he'd maintained for 40 days, at the light fixture at the far end that had finally been fixed 3 weeks ago after his maintenance ticket had gone unaddressed for months. The chairman role doesn't exist in the structure I'm rebuilding. The governance framework is being redesigned from the ground up over the next 60 days. There may be a place in that structure for someone who knows the operational history of this company well enough to help put it back together correctly. There may not. That determination comes later. Fair, Brian? He said the name without the warmth of the old familiarity and without the coldness of its complete absence. In the precise middle, where the truth of the situation actually lived. I don't know what we are to each other right now. That's honest. I think we'll figure it out. But I need you to understand something clearly: what you call the small decisions, the incremental agreements, each one defensible enough on its own that you could keep moving forward. Those are not actually small. They are never small. They are exactly the thing. They are always the thing. Brian nodded slowly. The nod of a man who is not going to argue, not because the argument is unavailable to him, but because he recognizes the truth in what he's hearing and has enough self-possession to let it stand without negotiation. I know, he said. Quietly. I know they are. He left. Kenneth stayed in the hallway. The new desk arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after day 40. He'd ordered it himself, from a furniture maker in Decatur, a small operation run by a man named Earl Simmons, who built custom pieces from a converted garage and whose work Kenneth had filed away 5 years ago. Under things I want when I can make choices like this. Pale ash wood. Mid-sized. Proportions made for work rather than impression. Drawers that ran quiet. It was already in the office when he arrived at 7:15 a.m. Donna had coordinated the delivery. Because Donna had the operational knowledge of the building's physical logistics, the way a musician has knowledge of an instrument. He set his laptop on the desk. His coffee thermos to the left, the same one from the Decatur apartment, kept because it poured well, and because he'd become attached to things that had been present through the difficult stretch. A legal pad. A pen. He opened the laptop. The email from Olivia Brandt was at the top of the inbox. 24 years old, running a logistics tech startup in Houston called Brandt Systems. 18 months old, 12 employees, a contract base growing faster than her operational infrastructure could sustain. She had written twice. Both emails had the same quality. Direct, not performative, the communication of someone who had something specific to say and no interest in decorating it. The second email, from 2 days ago. I don't want to work with a firm that tells me what I want to hear. I want to work with someone who understands what it actually costs to build something and then has to fight to keep it. I think that might be you now if it wasn't before, he replied. Olivia, I'd like to meet in person. Tell me when you're in Atlanta or when you'd like me to come to Houston, and we'll find a time. He sent it. Opened Pamela's operational review, 8 pages, single-spaced, the thorough document of someone who had been storing observations for 8 months and had finally been given the appropriate container for them. He read it beginning to end. Annotated in the margins. Made 3 calls between 8 and 9 and 9:30. George's first committee meeting was on a Wednesday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after day 40. The conference room on 16, not 28, not any of the executive floors. Kenneth had chosen 16 specifically because it was where most of the operational support staff worked, which meant the room itself communicated something about who the committee was before anyone opened their mouth. 7 people around the table: George, Pamela, 2 HR representatives, an outside labor attorney, Donna Mercer, and Kenneth. George arrived 5 minutes early and sat in the middle of the long side of the table, not the head, not a corner. The center. The position of someone who wanted to be present in the conversation rather than managing it from either end. He'd brought the thermos. The meeting ran 2 hours and 20 minutes, 30 past the scheduled end, because George had 7 years of specific, ground-level observation about how the building support staff experienced their working conditions, and the attorney and the HR representatives kept asking follow-up questions, because the specificity was exactly what they needed and did not usually get. At one point, the outside attorney asked George how he'd accumulated this level of detail about building operations across 7 years, and George said, "I paid attention. People stopped seeing me a long time ago. That meant I got to see everything." He said it without bitterness. As an operational fact. The room absorbed it in the way rooms absorb things that are simply and completely true. After the meeting, when the others had filed out, George stayed to stack the water glasses on the corner credenza, not a job requirement, just the way a man who had maintained spaces for 30 years moved through them. "That went well," Kenneth said. "It went honestly," George said. "That's better." Kenneth helped him stack the glasses. They worked together in the comfortable silence that had developed between them across 40 days, and was still developing, not quite friendship in the conventional vocabulary, not quite professional, Something in the space between those categories that was real in a way both men recognized without requiring it to be named. The thermos, Kenneth said, after a moment. Same one. George looked at it. Set it on the credenza, beside the glasses. Some things you keep because they work. His mother came on a Saturday, Rosalind Darrow. 58 years old, arrived at the building at 10 a.m. In clothes she'd selected for the occasion, not formal, but intentional. She walked through the lobby with the posture of a woman who had always moved through the world, as though her presence in any space was neither surprising nor provisional, and who had raised a son with the same understanding. Kenneth met her in the lobby. She looked around the carpet, the lighting, the Apex logo, in raised lettering on the wall, and she looked at it the way she'd looked at the business plan 23 years ago. Like she was measuring it against a version she'd been carrying in her head for a long time. It looks like you, she said. I picked the carpet, he said. I know. That's what I mean. He took her to 28. The desk. The window. Atlanta in the late morning, the city in full spring, the trees in the street grid showing the particular green of a season that has arrived and settled in and stopped being provisional. She stood at the window for a long time. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking about the kitchen table, she said. In the apartment on Frazier. The one that was also your desk and your conference room and every other flat surface you needed. A pause. You used to call me from that table at midnight when you were stuck. I'd talk you through it until you found the answer yourself, which was always about 20 minutes. You had the patience for it. I had the belief for it. Patience was just what the belief looked like from the outside. She turned from the window, looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with the specific directness of someone who had decided a long time ago that pretending not to see things was not a courtesy she was willing to extend, even to people she loved. Are you okay? He thought about the question. Not the version that required an automatic answer, but the actual question, the one that was asking something real and deserved something real in return. I'm getting there, he said. That's honest. I learned it from someone. She sat in the chair across from the desk, looked at the pale ash wood, the proportions, the way it fit the room without competing with it. Tell me about the man who brought the donuts, George. She said the name the way she filed everything that mattered carefully, in the right place. Tell me about him. He sat behind the desk, and he told her. Not the summary version, the full version, the texture of it. The 7 years and the thermos and the quality of George's attention, and the 3 times he'd thought about leaving, and the thing he'd said about deciding he wasn't wrong about people. She listened the way she had always listened, completely, without the partial attention of someone composing their response while the other person was still speaking. When he finished, she said, "He's the reason you know what you came back to." He hadn't framed it that way. But she was right, in the way she was usually right about the structural truth of things, even when the specific facts were new to her. Him, Kenneth said, and Pamela and Angela. He paused. And you? She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the window, because receiving certain things directly was its own kind of difficult, and the window gave her somewhere to look while she received it. You built something real, she said. Make sure you build what comes next on a foundation that belongs to you. The same words, the kitchen table, and now this window. 23 years between them. He looked at the desk, the laptop, the legal pad, the thermos he'd carried up from the basement, because it poured well, and he'd become attached to it, and he'd decided that was allowed. He looked at his mother standing at his window in his building in his city, looking out at a spring morning that was his to inhabit without apology. He had a company to rebuild. He had a desk that fit the room. He had, somewhere in the building below him, a man with a thermos and 30 years of paying attention and opinions about what decent treatment looked like, that he had never once been in a position to express to someone who could do something about them. Now he could do something about them. The morning ran forward. He opened his laptop. The email from Olivia Brandt. Next Thursday works. I'll come to Atlanta. I want to see what you've built, he replied. Thursday 10 a.m. I'll be here. He closed the email, opened the operational review, put his pen to the legal pad. The work, as it always had been, was the thing. Not the vindication that was real, but it was finished. It belonged to the 40 days which were done. What was in front of him was not finished, was in fact just beginning. He'd learned in 40 days of being invisible that the difference between a building that works and one that merely stands is not in the structure. It's in whether the people inside it believe someone is paying attention, whether they can trust that the things they do at 5:45 a.m. in service corridors that no one with a title ever visits are seen by someone who understands what they cost. He intended to be that person, not from the managed remove of executive communication, but from the knowledge of having been in the corridors. Having known that the light fixture at the far end of the 28th floor hallway had been the wrong wattage for 3 years, and that someone had noticed it, and that the notice had gone nowhere, and that the someone was still there anyway. Still showing up, still bringing the thermos, still leaving the donuts on the table for whoever needed them. He wrote the first thing on the list, then the second, then he kept going, because that was what it meant to own something. Not the legal fact or the equity percentage or the name on the filing. It meant the willingness to be responsible for what it was in its full complexity, including its failures and its silences, and the people it had failed to protect. He had been sick, and he had handed power to people he trusted, and they had made choices he could not have anticipated, and some of those choices had been the product of weakness, and some of ambition, and some of the particular human tendency to convince yourself that the small compromises are small enough that they don't accumulate. They always accumulated. He knew that now in the way that lived in the body, rather than the mind in the 40-day muscle memory of a cart that drifted left, a notebook that fit in a cargo pocket, a service elevator that smelled like metal, and was his, and had always been his, even when he was the only one who knew it. He put his pen to the paper. He wrote the first thing on the list, then the second, then he kept going, because there was a great deal left to do, and the morning was his, and so was the building, and so was the work.